Welcome everyone. Super excited to have you here. We are gonna go through a brief kind of community news and update, and then we'll have some intros from our awesome panelists here in the morning over in Europe, and then a bit of a chat, and we'll wrap up on the hour. So hopefully that will work. Let's see. So a bit of a poll here coming to figure out who is in the room, which I would normally do by asking you all to raise your hands, but obviously that can't happen. So we'll see if we can get that poll to pop up. Yeah, look at that. Yeah, so just keen to know how many of you guys have been to one of these before and a little bit about who you are. In terms of the tech protocols here, we use the chat for just kind of obviously chatting, intros, meeting people, commentary. Feel free to chuck stuff in there. In terms of Q&A, which we will definitely have time for, please use the Q&A button instead of the chat, and we'll actually curate those and get to ask the panelists a few of those. So in your little Zoom panel, you should have an actual Q&A button where you can click that and enter in a question for the panelists. Hopefully everyone had a chance to fill out that poll, and Jules will be able to share the results here in a second once we've had a go at that. Just wanted to thank my co-hosts here. So I'm Sarah from Agthentic. We are an innovation and sustainability advisory firm working at the intersection of agriculture and technology here in Australia, but also New Zealand, the US, and maybe a bit in Europe. We'll have to see. So we're really passionate about bringing innovation to agriculture that is useful and solves real problems for farmers. And I'm super thankful to my co-hosts at Platfarm and SproutX. Platfarm is an ag tech company based in South Australia, working in the precision ag and soil carbon space. And SproutX was Australia's first agri-tech accelerator based in Melbourne. So definitely check those out if you can. In terms of just a little bit of community news, if you haven't heard about the Australian AgriTech Association, it's the industry body here for ag tech in Australia, recently launched and just getting off the ground. Would love to have you guys check that out and show your support, helping to navigate the space here and raise the brand of Australian AgriTech globally. And a couple shout outs just to the ecosystem. So the Yield is one of the startups here, and they recently announced a fundraising round, which is pretty exciting and showing the growth of the ecosystem here. And then SVG Ventures and CSIRO partnership that was just launched, I think today, another kind of example of connectivity from Australia to the rest of the world. So that is largely it from me. I'll jump into the meetup here, or our panelists here. So I've got David and Pascal from the Consumer Brand and Shane Masters from Unigrains. And I guess you guys might be asking why we've had this meetup. Why have we invited some people from Europe and from France to talk about Australia and the grains industry and what kinds of innovations they might be able to share? I guess one of the things we found interesting is that, France produces and exports about the same amount of grain as we do here in Australia. And they've had some really interesting examples of innovation, one kind of long-standing and one much more recent, that we think Australian consumers and farmers and government and innovators can learn from. And so that's really what we want to share off tonight. So I guess the challenge for you guys in the audience, a mix of entrepreneurs and investors and government, is to think about, could these models be brought to Australia, and would they be useful? What would the barriers be? Where would they kind of fit in the system here? And for any farmers out there, do you see value in how these companies have been working with farmers over in France and the UK? So first up, we have David and Pascal from the Consumer Brand, and I'll have you guys start sharing your screen so you can present. Just as a bit of an intro for me while you guys get that up, the Consumer Brand is a branded food innovation that's really reversing things, going from fork to farm and shifting the power dynamics away from brands and retailers and really into the consumers and the farmers' hands. So you can kind of think of it like a fair trade model, I guess, in some ways. And it's one of the fastest growing retail brands in Europe. And Pascal and David will tell the story of what they've learned from the French example and what they're up to in the UK. So over to you guys.
Okay, so hello to everybody. But first of all, I'm a bit sorry because I've got an issue with my video. So you won't be able to see me speaking with my arms like a Latin person. But however, we hope that we will be able to share as much as possible of what we are doing. Maybe Pascal, you want to say something?
Yes. Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm just watching the webinar chat. It's great to see so many people, and we're very excited to share the story. I'll let David take over the presentation. That's how we'll plan this, and then in the Q&A, I'll jump in. Thank you.
Okay, so what I will propose in terms of introduction, I will go quite fast in each slide, but further on during our call, I think we can see specific aspects of what we are developing. So, c'est qui le patron, which means who is the boss in English. It's true that you can see this map and you can see that we are starting in several countries already. But we are not at all what we could call a multinational corporation. We are just speaking about people, consumers, who are sharing the same value about trust, transparency, animal welfare, environment, and fair trade. And but we decided to be together and to create our own brand because somewhere we wanted to have a bit more control on our own food. Yeah, so all the initiative started in 2016 in France. And in 2016, it was a really deep crisis in the dairy sector, like it has been also in other countries in Europe. To give you an idea, because I think we have some farmers with us, a lot of farmers with us, the farmers were being paid like 21 or 22 cents per liter when the average production cost was around 28 cents. So every day the farmers were feeding their animals or milking the cows. They were losing a lot of money, leading them in some cases in a disastrous financial situation. And we had, and we can see, I think you can see these numbers, 732. It's a horrid number because in this year, due to these financial issues, 732 farmers in France killed themselves because they could not see the light in the end of the tunnel. So obviously, it was perfectly unacceptable. How can we accept that somebody kill himself because producing milk? I mean, eventually, if they were producing a nuclear weapon, we could understand, but producing milk. So Nicolas Chaban, the founder of this initiative, decided to do something, and yes, decided that us consumers, we could support our farmers. And it came from a very simple math. In average, in France, we are consuming about 50 liters of milk per person. So if we as consumer, we accept to pay 8 cents more per liter when we buy our milk, it means that in the end of the year, for 4 euros, we can change completely the capability of our farmers to break even their enterprises. So how could we do that? So very fast, Nicolas Chaban created and through the social network gathered a lot of consumers around him. They decided to create their own brand, C'est qui le patron, and from this own brand, the consumers were deciding of what should be the criteria to buy their product, and one of them was the fair trade to the farmers. To go fast, this had a huge success in France. 4 years after, we are speaking about around 3,000 of farmers, families who can have a decent living from their operation. More than 150 million of product has been sold, and at least 15 million of consumers bought one of those products at least once. I am okay, Sarah, not too fast or too slow?
Nope, you're all good.
Yeah. So how it works, very fast. from the C'est qui le patron team, and together with farmers, with processors, we build up what we call a questionnaire. And this questionnaire should help any consumers to make their choice on how they want their product being produced. In this case, we have the example of the flour. This example is also interesting because recently a next step has been done. The fair trade for farmers, it's not only for consumers' product, like this box of flour, but also it's reaching the industrial part. Because yes, from the fair trade of the consumer's flour, it has been developed also a brand for bakers. So I would say we know today that the farming has a lot of issues, not so much from the retail part with this crisis, but yes, because the industrial cannot be supporting them. But in this case, yes, the fair trade is both from consumers and industrial. We are speaking about kindness being the fuel of economic model. And we just have quickly this slide to show you what happened in France with this coronavirus crisis. Indeed, like everywhere, all the consumers rushed to the supermarket. All the consumers started to cook much more at home, and farmers linked to C'est qui le patron and C'est qui le patron had exceptional profit. But immediately, it didn't seem fair that not because our works we had exceptional profit when others people could have exceptional loss, which was not their fault neither. So C'est qui le patron and the associated farmers decided to share their exceptional profit to the people in need. It has been created a fund that after very few days reached 750,000 euros. And this fund is going to support small businesses in villages, is going to support nurse, hospital, and the last part, because I think also it's very important, like certainly in Australia, a lot of bars, restaurants had to close, so they've got no way to have any revenue. So C'est qui le patron decided to partnership with the e-commerce company and logistic. So the consumers can order on a website their product, and the product will have as delivery point all of these small bars or restaurants or small retailers who had to close, which can help them to have a revenue during this lockdown. And our last slide, it's the consumer brand. So Pascal and myself, we are the consumers who decided to develop also such initiative in England. We started 9 months ago, and we can say that we are in a good track. It's true that the communication nowadays is not so easy to flow. However, but we start to have a significant support from farmers, from consumers. We start to be known, and but we wish that all these very positive things that happen in France start also to come over in the UK. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, David. Great. And we have a question coming through on the chat, but I might save that until a bit of the discussion, if that's all right. And we'll flip over to Shane. So David, if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we'll have Shane share his. See if we can manage that. So while we do that, I'll embarrass Shane with a little bit of an intro. So Shane is an Aussie originally, and he will tell us about Unigrains, which is a farmer-owned and fully unsubsidized investment fund that was really built to support the French grains industry. So for anyone at this meetup who's familiar with the Australian RDC system, this should definitely give you something to think about, because really with no levy payments or subsidies from the government, Unigrains has grown this fund and now invests about $200 million annually into French food and agribusiness. And Shane's going to tell us a little bit about how they've done that and what they're up to.
Thanks, Sarah. Is my mute off? Can you hear me?
Mute is off. Yes, you're a bit quiet, so louder is probably better.
So I grew up on a grain farm on the west coast of South Australia, and then went off on life's journey and ended up, for the last 3 years, I've been working with Unigrains based out of Paris. And I think it's an interesting structure that very few people know about in France, and really it's a kind of a food and agri industry, like a future fund for French grain farmers in a way. But it's a bit different from GDRC, and I'll get to the differences. But I think something like this could be interesting for certainly the grains industry in Australia and the agri industry to think about. So I think, first of all, just to give some context, and Sarah, you touched on it, the similarities between the French grain industry and the Australian grain industry. First of all, this slide's just to break down what do the French grow, and mostly it's soft wheat, whilst Australia it's hard wheat. In terms of volume of wheat production, it's not too dissimilar, depending if there's a drought in Australia or France, what they call a drought. It's about the same in terms of wheat, just different types of wheat. And where does France sit in the terms of European grains production? So they're huge. They're the giants of Europe. They produce over a quarter on average of grains in total. And then if you compare the total tonnage of grains, that's wheat and everything else, that France produce, it's about the same that Australia produces in terms of a total volume of grains. So again, pretty similar production size, although French do it on a much smaller territory. And then in terms of export, Australia and France, again, depending on the drought cycle, it's about the same. It's pretty similar in terms of volume of grains exported around the world, although the French do much more in value because they value add their products a bit more than just bulk exports as we do in Australia. And again, I'll touch on why that's relevant. So with that context, saying it's not too dissimilar of the total grain produced in France and Australia. Where did Unigrains come from? What does it do? And why that could be something for grain farms and the grain industry in Australia to think about. So Unigrains was set up back in the 60s, and basically it's similar to GDRC in the sense that it started off getting levies from growers and government assistance, and then kind of continued, and instead of investing for the on-farm productivity and marketing of grains, which is the remit of GDRC, Unigrains really could only invest into the value add part of the industry. So they were investing minority investments, loans into the value add, so grain storage and all those types of things. So Unigrains invests across the value chain, from small, from early stage venture investments through to the large co-ops, and then they also invest into other private equity funds, venture capital funds, all that have some direct or indirect benefit back to the agri industry in France, and usually back to grain growers in the grain industry. Here's a map that I drew trying to explain where are the investments at the moment. And Unigrains has over 100 current investments. They've invested over 1.4 billion Aussie right now on their balance sheet, which is all controlled and owned by the French grain farmers, with a few minority investments from some of the agri banks. But again, it's not just grains, but they're kind of across everything. They invest from Burger King through to import companies, mostly French. My job was to come in and try and help them internationalize and invest some of that money outside of France. And the next slide, this is breaking down their core mandate, which is to invest in everything that moves from the grain industry through to the value add packaging side of wheat production, effectively. And how has that link? Well, how does that link back to Australia? Last year, when Cargill sold its global malting business, Unigrains was one of the big investors that backed the French grain co-op Axreal, that owns Bourmalt, that bought the Cargill business. So the Joe White malting assets in Australia are now all owned by a French grain co-op, and Unigrains is a minority investor in that grain co-op. Back in 2008, Australian Grain Technologies opened up its capital, and a co-op that Unigrains have invested in France, that has a subsidiary called Villemar, invested together with GDRC Sardi and University of Adelaide into AGT, which is one of the wheat breeders in Australia. So that's a kind of little link, but again, Unigrains doesn't do anything directly in Australia. It has no intention of doing it, but it does it kind of indirectly through its family of investments. And back to why we're here, which is venture, innovation, agtech. The way Unigrains interacts with that space, I mean, it's had some history of doing it directly, which didn't really work out for various reasons. So then they went to supporting the ecosystem, so universities, accelerators. Then they started investing into other funds, like Sarah's fund. If she was in France, Unigrains would have invested into that fund. And only in January this year, Unigrains has set up for the first time its own venture fund, which is pretty small, but think of it as a small version of Grain Innovate, which is a JV between GDRC and Artesian that was set up last year. So Unigrains have just kind of dipped its toe into setting up its own venture activity, but again, still really small, but it has a lot of money. It invests effectively the same as what GRDC invests every year, 200 million Aussie, but across everything that moves in food and ag, because there's just not enough grain investments anymore. They don't get any levies from farmers because that's stopped. It's just self-funding. They pay a dividend out to the farmer groups for their activities of promotion and having a voice for grain farmers. But there's no government involvement and no levies anymore. But it did have it originally. And thanks to compound interest in 50 years, it's now sitting on a lot of capital that it wants to deploy around the world to support agri-industry, but in particular the French grain growers where it can. That's it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shane. So you can stop sharing your screen and we'll have a bit of a chat. So I think maybe where we want to start, there were a couple of kind of clarification questions coming through in terms of the consumer brand and Tequila Patron. Maybe Shane, actually, you can tell us what your experience is as a consumer in France interacting with this new kind of brand. And then I might have another couple clarification questions, but let's start there.
Yeah, so I came across it in my job. They presented at one of our events, and basically it's not a private label because but it's not a Nestle. It's this in-between brand that it shows on the packet of flour how much money is going back to the farmer, or the eggs. Like if you buy eggs, it's a very it looks like a private label brand, but you buy it and it's very clear where the money goes to who and what impact you're having. And the interesting thing that I've seen is it's popping up in every single supermarket. It doesn't matter if it's the two big leaders in France, they're stocking it because for them it doesn't compete against their own private label, and it doesn't compete against the big branded dairy companies if it's milk, or flour if it's against the big flour companies. But for those people that aren't just going for price, it doesn't take away that market share. And for those people that want to have a positive impact and don't want to give away their money to a multinational, it kind of fits in between. And what they've done is to open up these brands around Europe. It's like a local brand in each of the countries, but it's the same concept. And it's helping farmers, which we're super supportive of, but we can't invest in them because then they'll be conflicted. To be credible, they can't be owned by farmers. It has to be the voice of the consumer, having a positive impact, because that's what the consumers want. And it's no marketing budget, and it's everywhere. So that's the exciting thing.
I love it. We mostly brought Shane on to champion the consumer brand and Tequila Patron. No, just kidding. But maybe Pascal, do you want to explain a little bit about how the surveys work and kind of how you go about developing a product and kind of how that process works to involve consumers and farmers?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. Shane, also thank you. It's great what you say about it. So a questionnaire starts with the consumers. The consumers decide what products we should be looking into. And then we do our baseline research, but it's really about involving the stakeholders in that supply chain, so the farmers and the processors. And in order to make this a fair process and reward people properly, we need to understand what the actual cost is. So if you ask a farmer, how much does it really cost? Sometimes you're going to get an answer where they aren't considering paying themselves a living wage, or they're not paying, they're not considering all the extra labor that they're putting into it. So we really drill down into that actual cost. And then we look at different factors. We have 4 factors: a market price, a break-even price, a fair price, and a capability to reinvest, and a fair price and capability to afford a lifestyle employer relief farmer. And we're actually seeing consumers in France, a lifestyle and employer relief farmer is the #1 choice. They're really championing farmer well-being and a fair price. In the UK, we're seeing it to be able to reinvest. That's because possibly the farmers don't have the same image in the eyes of the public as they do in France. But it's really about involving the stakeholders and the processes to get the value. And then we list all the options. We have no bias in what we list or the information that we present. It's really about providing clear information for consumers to make their decision and really understand the cost that it will come to.
Yeah, great. And what are you seeing in terms of trends that consumers want? I guess we hear a lot about, consumers want to vote with their dollar and they care about sustainability and this and that. But what are you seeing? And I guess there's a question here too from Paul on do you guys have a policy around certain things like GMOs or anything like that?
Yeah, maybe I will.
Yeah, go ahead,
I'm
David.
sorry again. I will share one of the slides again, and I think it's a good translation about the consumer. Sorry, just an instant. Yeah. Do you see this chart in the bottom part of the slide?
Yes.
Right. So this has been a kind of massive study done in England from the government in England, in the United Kingdom, in order to understand where we were in terms of trust, transparencies, and expectations of the consumers regarding to the food supply chain. And what it is amazing here, it's you see every bar is representing a stakeholder from the supply chain. So you have the farmers in the blue one, you have the green food processors, supermarket in this kind of gray or light blue color,
yeah,
food service, and government. And it has been asked to a massive number of consumers, okay, in terms of trust and transparencies and expectation regarding to those stakeholders, where are you? How much do you trust them? So we can see that in the UK, the consumers massively trust the farmers on the fact that they can care about people. You can see that on the same way, sorry, here, the consumers trust that among all the stakeholders, the farmers are the most credible when we are on talking the walk and about taking care of animals, and the same in terms of environment. The only weaker point, I would say, it's the communication from the farmers to the consumers. So to answer your question, Sarah, first, there is a huge trust from the consumers placed on the farmer. Now, it's true that people, because we are just people, we can have different concerns. Some people will be much more motivated by the fact that, yes, we have a positive action in terms of environment, others in terms of animal welfare, others because, yes, not all the farmers are gentleman farmers, but also people who are working hard with some difficulties in the end of the month. And consumers understand that they need to have their support. And I would say the most important, in a moment where we don't know exactly where we are going, where we have a lot of message, but trust, it's very important. And to understand where is going our money. Are we sure that what we pay for is going to right hands? And that's why we are extremely optimistic. about the fact that, yes, in the UK, we will be able to reconnect consumers and farmers to go to a much more positive situation.
Mm. And in terms of like the different categories there, you have price paid to the farmer. As a result of this, consumers are actually picking not only the attributes they care about, but also how the farmers are rewarded. Is that right?
Exactly. So, right now we have a questionnaire online. We are getting close to 500 answers, and we have already a very strong trend. I can say that more than 95% of the consumers who answered the questionnaires are voting for fair trade to farmers. What we call fair trade to farmers in this case, it's to pay a price which allows the farmer, one, to cover his operation cost, and to be able to get enough cash to be able to reinvest. For example, for the egg producers to be able to invest in the next group of hens, or to be able to adapt his own structure with a bit more productivity, etc. And to be able also to have some times for themselves. Because more and more consumers understand that maybe we can give a different life to the farmers than the permanent 24/7.
Yeah, there's a really good question here in the Q&A from Rob Bloom about farmers have a really good standing in France, and French consumers are really engaged, almost activists, he says. So how are you seeing the performance in the UK versus what you saw, the rapid uptake of Ce Qui La Patronne in France? And I guess the comment maybe on everyone's mind is can you see this working in Australia? But first, how are you seeing it play out in the UK?
Okay, so mainly two major differences. When the first one, it's you are right. In France, we are permanently on strike. I think we've got it in our genetic. And the other aspect, it's I would say almost everybody in France has a relative who is a farmer. So automatically, farming for anybody, it's very important in France. In the UK, obviously, strikes and revolution are not so common than in France. Not so much people as farmers as relatives. We are speaking in the UK 67 million inhabitants population, and you have around 300,000 farmers or people working in farms. However, there is something that it's extremely strong in the UK. It's really people cares about their landscape, and people cares about animal welfare. Mm-hmm. And in the end, when we are speaking about fair trade to farmers, environment, and animal welfare, all of this is going together. So I would say, yes, the way to pick on this initiative will be a bit different than in France, but the right feelings are also there.
Yeah, great. And how about Australia? Do you see any potential here, and maybe any aspiring entrepreneurs or collaborators in our audience tonight that might put their hand up to work with you? How do you see the Australian market?
Okay, so you are speaking about somebody who is completely fascinated by Australia. I've been lucky enough to visit Australia, to spend time there a few years ago. And I have to say, I just enjoy the country culture. I just enjoy the people there. They are, how can I say, kind of freedom thought, their independence thinking, and the fact that you are looking for the right balance between your professional life and your personal life. And I can see all the components to effectively being able to have a lot of people uniting together in order effectively to create a positive trend and a positive movement. Now, I would say, what it is interesting in this initiative. It's fulfilling all the dots in the supply chain. We start to speak with the farmers. We align the farmers and the processors. We invite the consumers in expressing their opinion, and we involve the retailers in supplying our product to the maximum of possible consumers. So certainly nothing you cannot do in Australia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shane, as an Aussie, I'm curious your thoughts on the viability of both models. Kind of how do you see this model working in Australia and the Unigrains model as well? What kind of opportunities or barriers do you see for both?
Look, it'll be very interesting to see how Coles and Woolies react. I mean, do you have to launch this and go through the independents, and then you gain traction with the independent supermarkets? I mean, Australia is very unique with its structure of supermarkets, and I don't know if that's then a killer that, okay, you are getting to Coles or Woolies, and can this really take off? I mean, in France, the supermarkets are very competitive, and you've got the German low-cost supermarkets that are coming in that are taking market share. You know, the big French supermarkets have gone international now that some are coming back, and it's been a huge success in those supermarkets that would normally compete together. They're still putting the product in their aisles, and what we're seeing also is some of those supermarkets doing copycats. So they're taking the same concept and trying to implement some of those things into their own private label products and commodity products. So yeah, I don't know. I think it could still work, but it'll be interesting to see how you navigate the supermarkets, because they crush you if you get it wrong. In terms of Unigrains, it's I mean, Unigrains has had a long time to build up a lot of capital, and I don't even think the farmers know it exists in France. Although we have farmers that sit on our board, and it's owned by, you know, the wheat growers and corn growers of France. And we fund a lot of their activities to give them a voice on the political stage in France and Europe. I don't know. It's an interesting time for Australia, because Australia's going through the review of the RDC systems. Can levies be used more effectively? How does it evolve? Back in the 90s when it was set up, you know, it was world leading in terms of taking levy grower money, and what it's done for the Australian growers is phenomenal. But then, you know, how does it evolve and continue to be, you know, the next generation of RDCs? What do they look like? So it's an interesting timing. I don't think the Unigrains model transfers exactly into the Australian context, but, you know, there's elements of it that, I mean, you know, we've got the Australian Future Fund, we've got the Future Drought Fund, all these things that are thinking, you know, generations ahead, that we could take and adapt to each of the grower groups. Or is there a fund for all growers in Australia? And then how do you manage interest between the growers? But the concept's there. It's nothing new, and I think it can work in Australia without, you know, the subsidies, because Unigrains didn't get subsidies. It was through grower levies that it started, and I think that the concept exists in Australia.
Yeah, great. And there was a question from Guy before about how the growers, or how decisions are made now. Do growers still have involvement in that? You mentioned a board. How does that work?
So on my floor, the president of Unigrains, he's a grower from just south of Paris, a grain grower. He sits in the office, and then the vice president also is a grower. They're both representatives that have come through the grain grower associations. So there's basically two associations, because the wheat growers are much stronger than corn growers. Those two farmers sit on both executive committees. So my ultimate boss is a farmer. And then what happens is, when we get the investments coming through their networks, a lot of them come through the co-ops, a lot of them come through the grain companies. You know, they'll come into us because we're owned by farmers. So we get deals that no one else gets, and we don't want to control the companies. So again, we get deals that we shouldn't have or normally got, and we invest for 5, 10, sometimes we've invested for 30 years. And, you know, every family-owned company or co-op wants us to be an investor, because one is, our capital is probably a bit cheaper than most, because our returns, we're looking for more of a positive impact than a pure 20% return, which is impossible in most agri companies. I mean, the Tattinger Champagne family, when they wanted to buy it back from a private equity company, they came to us and we helped fund them. So Champagne has nothing to do with grains, but still, it's it's a diversification. We've got a lot of capital. How do we use it so that it's ready for the next big? How do we help our grain farmers do what they want to do? And last year it was the Cargill malt acquisition. But farmers are very involved in deciding who runs Unigrains. A couple of them sit on our ultimate investment committees, and every now and again they'll veto something that isn't matching with what they think should happen. But it's extremely rare. Usually the investment team get to kind of do what they do because what we do is usually in line with what we know that the farmers are ultimately comfortable with.
Yeah, and I guess on the on the consumer brand side, David or Pascal, how have you seen the farmers react? I mean, I imagine it's quite positive, but do you have any stories of how farmers are reacting to be involved in quite a different supply chain?
So, in fact, we have it's true that among our followers, we had very fast lot of farmers. It's true that Pascal and myself, we are very linked to the farmers. My grandparents were farmers. Pascal has farming experience in different countries. And we both had a post-graduation from the Royal Agricultural University in the UK. So we had a natural link with the farmers. Now, in terms of reaction, yes, it's nice to see them, or even being surprised that we can be fair with them. And one of our principles, it's when we are building up a product, a questionnaire, it's not to meet the farmers and to start a strong negotiation. It's really to sit with the farmers, with the union, and to ask, okay, what are your real costs? What are your needs? What should be the fair price? And it's amazing because we are sometimes really insisting, but no, you need more. It cannot be only 1 cent or 2 cents. They've been so used to be squeezed, to have a huge pressure on reducing their costs, then now it seems that sounds hard to eventually have a fair reward. So it's the kind of reaction that we are seeing. And now, yes, I think a lot of them are also trying to reconnect with consumers, and I think it's a very positive evolution on this aspect. So.
Yeah, great. And I think, Pascal, you have some maybe farming experience in Australia. Is that right?
Yeah, I was on a cattle station in northern Queensland for a little while a few years ago, which was it was an eye-opening experience for me, and that's really where I fell in love with agriculture. I always thought I would go back. I still hope to come back and do a bit of that, but it was a lot of fun and a lot of respect for the guys out there. Guys and gals out there.
Great. A question here from Ollie. Are you seeing growers actually changing their farming systems, either in the UK or in France, switching to regenerative agriculture or changing practices in some way based on what they're seeing from consumers and the voting that consumers are doing?
Okay, but maybe we can comment from the different interactions we have with farmers through the social network. I would say almost everybody is willing to effectively go into a much more sustainable farming, go back to tasty, etc. food. However, there is an issue in the market. It is, do the market is ready to pay to support the farmers in their transition? For example, if we take, we have some figures. If we take a mixed farm in the UK, average, so we would speak about 80, 100 hectares. We would speak about 100, 120 cows. When effectively these kind of farms want to go from a very strict or very conventional production to a much more sustainable one, the cost will be between 30 to 40, 45,000. So when you are being paid very close already to your break even, we understand that the will is there, but it's big question and doubt for the farmers doing the first step because the cost and the reward on the cost. So maybe this could be a summary of what can be the situation.
Yeah. The kind of worse before better dynamics of a transition are always interesting. I don't know, Shane, if you've seen from a kind of investment perspective, things that Unigrains have invested in that have helped farmers to think about shifting production systems or value chains, whether that's more value adding or diversification, regenerative. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the big agri groups in France are still owned by co-ops. So it's usually the way a co-op goes through it is they'll start to dip their toe in the water by making either having their own startup, acquiring something, grow that business. If they see there's value back to their farmers, then they'll invest more into it. Maybe they'll make acquisitions, and that's when Unigrains starts to get involved in, do we fund that? And we've invested in the largest organic distribution company in France, fruit and vegetable organic distribution business, because there's huge growth for organics. There's huge price premiums. Most of the organics are coming in from Germany because they're the biggest market, but the French growers are still a couple of years behind, so they just can't produce enough for the consumer demand that's happened. I'll give you an example with eggs. 2012, there was a big change in legislation for Europe saying basically small caged eggs are being phased out, within the next 5 to 10 years. So most of the French farmers switched to large cages, so a bird can open its wings, turn around, and not touch the edge of the cages. Most of the countries in Northern Europe went completely cage free, so barn laid or free range or organic. But most of the French went into big cages, as did Spain. What's happened, even though that was legislation, over the last 3 years, all the French supermarkets have said, actually, due to consumer sentiment, we're banning caged eggs completely from our shelves. And in 2 years' time, we're not going to sell any caged eggs. And so all the farmers that have just invested in massive investments that will take 12 to 15 years to pay off, they're caught out by, well, okay, we've got great cages and we can only sell our eggs into ingredients, which is the worst commodity egg you can sell. So Unigrains funded into some of the co-ops that did the original change. And now we're looking at equipment producers that are going to help the farmers replace from large cages to barn laid to organic. But we're not a subsidy. We don't put money directly into farmers, although we do have a couple of future farmer support groups. There's nothing where we'll help farmers convert to organic. Moreover, we'll kind of invest into co-ops or companies that are helping farmers facilitate transition because of changing consumer sentiments.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, kind of where's the dial on how sensitive to consumers do we really want to be? If they, how much do they know and how informed are they about the food system and the challenges of production, and how much of a vote can and should we give them?
On that point, we've actually got, there's a group within our building that we fund called Passion Céréales. It's like, I don't even know how to translate that, but it's for love of grains, and it's this group that's basically like this marketing, guerrilla marketing group that go out and tell the stories of farmers, and they're very proactive in helping farmers communicate back, because there's a massive glyphosate. That's basically, there were mayors around France in little towns that were shutting down. Farmers in their region around these towns couldn't use glyphosate. And that was this huge political hot potato where regulations were behind. If we had to ban glyphosate, then the Ukrainian grain, which is our biggest competitor, would flood our markets and the French guys wouldn't be competitive. We can't all switch to organic. So we've got a group there that it's a voice, but for the consumer, that we're helping educate people, saying, yeah, this is all great, but the impact that's going to have on your baguette prices means you're going to get grain from Ukraine anyway. And how do we do that in a way that doesn't wipe out our industry at the same time? Knowing we want to be pesticide free, but there's a speed of which we all need to go out. Otherwise, you just wipe out people's livelihoods.
Go ahead, Shane.
No, that's just a couple of things that are in the Unigrains family that, again, I mean, you can find them on websites, but it's very difficult to piece together that they're actually all funded from. Unigrains is the core funding source of it. It's not government. This is the farmers themselves that have able to self-fund their voice and communication. How effective it is, it's difficult to gauge, but at least it's something.
Yeah. Emma Leonard had a great question, hi Emma, about with the news of the of China putting a tariff on Australian barley, there was a surge in search terms around what is barley, and so that's maybe a little bit scary in consumers voting for what our food system looks like. I don't know, David or Pascal, have you thought at all about, like, even in just designing those surveys, you're helping to make some choices about what you're presenting to consumers? You know, you're not giving them a blank page and saying, design your food system. You're helping shape some choices. How do you think about what goes on that survey and what kinds of options are farmers involved in all in that process?
Okay, so but first, it's true that if we want to be successful, if we want to convince, I think we need also to bring a lot of information. The approach needs to be extremely educational about what it is farming, the why of each option that can make a consumer. And if you go to C'est qui le patron questionnaire, or to our questionnaire, which is in English, you will understand how deep we try to inform the consumers in order to take the right decision. It's true that now with the Brexit, there is a lot of doubt and a lot of question of what would be the consequence of the new free trade agreement, and how effectively the British farming will be protected, or I would say rightly considered, because we know that sometimes the cheaper price can be an illusion, and it's also what we try to communicate. What we can see from the eggs questionnaire, for example, 100% of the consumers are selecting British origins for their eggs. I don't know if it can answer, but I think, yes, there is a conscience that we need to support also the national production.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's interesting. There was a question here from Scott Morrell about how, you know, COVID-19 that we're all obviously facing has heightened government and consumer awareness around food security. And I think all of us have probably experienced, you know, going to the supermarket. I know my favorite soup wasn't on the shelf for, you know, 3 or 4 weeks. And, you know, in small and large ways, that moment of like, oh, wow, this is really tangible for us. I imagine, well, I guess the question from Scott is that kind of helps the consumer brand in some ways, because it's brought some of these food security and domestic production and support for farmers, these issues to the front of mind. Whereas, you know, I don't know, does it change the approach of Unigrains? Are you guys thinking more about domestic versus global? Like, where any thoughts on the kind of global versus national debate that we're all about to wade into here?
So is that a question for me?
Yeah, just a little one to end with.
Yeah, it's a really topical issue, and COVID is only heightening that. I mean, basically, as a result of COVID, a lot of the French ministers were coming out to say, "Hey, look, buy local, buy French. It's shorter supply chains because supermarkets are running out of food." There's a unique system in France where you've got supermarkets and then these markets that roam from town to town. Those markets were shut down, and then they started delivering all their goods into local supermarkets. So, but then in terms of Unigrains, look, it's a sensitive issue, because we're at our core, we're here to support directly where we can French grain farmers, and that's difficult because we don't ever do things that have any improvement in their productivity. It's always indirectly through co-ops or companies or acquisitions. So we've invested a lot into international investment funds. We've invested into some international companies that don't really have a link back to France, but the long-term view of the grain growers that sit on our ultimate board are that we need to start increasing networks and knowledge of industries, and that's only a good thing for France, because in the end, the same competitors that Australia has and France have are exactly the same. You know, they just grow different types of grains. So If people are eating more grains in bread products or pasta, that's only a good thing for the types of grains that the French farmers and Australian farmers grow. But it's a bit of a sensitive one.
Yeah, right. Awesome. Well, we are just about out of time. Thanks everyone for coming. My last question for you, Shane, is for any of the entrepreneurs in the audience that want to pitch you an idea or an investment. How should they go about doing that so that you can maybe look at investing in their company or business?
Look, hit me on LinkedIn. That's probably the quickest way. Yeah. If it's not me, maybe it's one of the companies we've invested in, or the investment funds we've invested in, or I'll put them back to you because.
Yes, yeah. Any Australian startups in the ag and food space, come talk to us. That would be great. Or Julia at SproutX as well. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And yeah, we'll pop up the results of those polls if we have them so people can see who else was in the room. Would love to hear feedback from any of you guys and love to keep this conversation going on the AusAgritech Twitter. So please get on there and tweet, and we'll keep this conversation going and be able to share some slides and information too. So thanks everyone so much. Have a good night. Have a good morning. Thanks, Shane. Thanks, Pascal. Thanks, David. We will catch you guys soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Or good night.
Bye.